Welcome to today's webinar, Moving to the AWS Cloud, an overview of the AWS Cloud Adoption Framework. Our presenter today is Lawden Williams. Lawden is a Principal Cloud Enterprise Architect with AWS. Today with us, we also have a great team of moderators who will be engaging with you and answering your questions throughout the presentation. So keep those questions coming. Our moderators' names today are Aaron, Curran, and Gianni. Lawden, welcome. The floor is now yours. Go ahead and begin.
Thanks, I appreciate that. And again, welcome. This is Moving to the AWS Cloud, an overview of the AWS Cloud Adoption Framework. I am Lawden Williams. I am a Principal Cloud Enterprise Architect with AWS Professional Services. I'd like to start by setting a little bit of a context for this conversation. I really love this quote because I think it really does a great job of summarizing what we're really going to talk about through this session. And it's a quote from Arnold Bennett that says, "All change, even a change for the better, is always accompanied by drawbacks and discomforts." And one of the things that we see as this recurrent theme with our customers as they adopt the cloud is managing that change, managing that transformation. And so as a design principle and a goal, as we put together the cloud adoption framework, we're really trying to help you, the customer, minimize those drawbacks and discomforts. So really what we want you to be able to do at the end of this is really understand how to use the cloud adoption framework to really help you rapidly transform your business with cloud. So start with the big question. So what is the AWS Cloud Adoption Framework? And the AWS Cloud Adoption Framework helps organizations understand how cloud adoption transforms the way they work. It leverages our experiences assisting organizations really across every segment, really across every geography of the world with their cloud adoption journey. From a professional services perspective, the majority of the engagements that we do with customers begin with working with this cloud adoption framework to really help customers understand their cloud adoption journey. There are a few things I always like to make sure that people know about the cloud adoption framework. The first one is actually pretty important, which is the AWS Cloud Adoption Framework. It's not specific to AWS. However, it heavily leverages our experiences here at AWS and what we see as sort of the best patterns and practices for adopting cloud. Second, it's really not restricted to AWS use. We actually do make this fully available on our website, so you can download all the details around the Cloud Adoption Framework. We also allow it to be leveraged directly by our partner network as well. There's really no secret sauce to it. I think this is the other thing. If we have information relating to cloud adoption, we make that freely available to anyone that wants that information. So there's really no secret sauce. The Cloud Adoption Framework isn't something where we say, we'll give you a little bit of an overview, but if you want to know more, contact us. As soon as we have information that's relevant, we try to make that available publicly to anyone that wants to leverage the Cloud Adoption Framework. And then the final piece here is really critical. One of the things that we've done in the latest iteration and update to the Cloud Adoption Framework is really help to focus on this idea of an action plan. It's not just about the framework itself. It's how do you use the framework to do something in your organization. And just to show a little bit of that, this is an example of what we call an action plan summary. And we'll get into a little bit more details on this throughout this webinar, but it just gives you an idea of how we think about this, which is really the framework offers 6 perspectives, which we'll talk about in a moment, and each of those sort of spawn these work streams within your organization that are really important to your ability to manage the changes associated with cloud adoption and really be successful in your cloud adoption journey. So how do we begin? Well, what we start with when we talk with customers or talk customers through using the Cloud Adoption Framework is we start by saying, who are these stakeholders that are critical to cloud adoption? So if we take a problem or we take sort of an outcome that you, the customer, wants to drive to with your cloud adoption journey, we start by saying, who are the stakeholders that are critical to that cloud adoption path? And then what we do is we take those stakeholders and we group them into 6 perspectives. Those perspectives then allow us to understand cloud adoption from the view of those stakeholders. And I'll just share, one of the things that we see oftentimes with customers undergoing cloud adoption is they think of this very much as a technical problem. This is just an IT problem. And what we really learned through our experiences in working with customers is that the problem is much broader than simply just a technical problem. And so by leveraging CAF to help understand your stakeholders, and then by leveraging CAF to really help you understand the types of things those stakeholders care about, you can ensure the success of your cloud journey. The 6 CAF perspectives are shown on the screen right now. We break them down into 2 broad categories. On the left-hand side, we have 3 categories, our 3 perspectives: business, people, and governance. And those perspectives focus on business stakeholders and business capabilities that are changed with cloud adoption. On the right-hand side, we focus on technical capabilities and the technical stakeholders. And those are really the platform, security, and operations perspectives. And again, each perspective identifies a set of the stakeholders' capabilities that transform with cloud adoption. And this is also a piece of the cloud adoption framework that we really look to update with this newest iteration. What we really want to think about is how cloud adoption impacts the capabilities owned by these stakeholders. And I'll get into this a little bit more detail here over the next couple of slides. So with each capability, we identify what skills and what processes will transform with cloud adoption. And most importantly, how to create a plan to address those gaps. And so just to take a moment and just talk through the framing of this, just so you understand how we're framing the problem. We think of a capability as a what, meaning what does that stakeholder do organizationally? What capability does that stakeholder provide to the organization? And we think of things like skills and processes as the how. How do you execute that capability to deliver value to the organization? And what we're really looking at when we think about cloud adoption is the what rarely changes for the organization. So for example, if you own the business capability of selling products and services to customers, you'll continue to sell products and services to customers after you've adopted the cloud. However, how you do that may change significantly. Having access to better real-time data anytime, any place might fundamentally change how you execute. But the what still remains. And so when we're looking at this from the eyes of a stakeholder, one of the things we're hoping that the cloud adoption framework does for those stakeholders is helps them understand that what they do inherently doesn't change, but really what they have to think about is how to transform the skills and processes that they use to data execute that capability into new cloud-enabled skills and processes. I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the audience, the typical audience for each perspective, and talk through some of the starter capabilities that are included in the current version of the cloud adoption framework. So if we start with the business perspective, and again, the business perspective is focused on business stakeholders and business capabilities. The types of stakeholders we typically see are people like business managers, finance managers, budget owners, and strategy stakeholders. And you'll see on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see a list of the capabilities that we see are some of the critical capabilities that really transform with cloud adoption in order to provide the highest level of business value. And to start, we talk about IT finance. And a way to think about IT finance is this. For many organizations, you're making an inherent and fundamental change from capital expense to variable expense. You're moving from this process of budgeting, where budgeting used to be, what did you spend last year? Here's what you get, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, to having to rethink your budgeting process to account for things like variable cost structures. So while IT finance will remain a core capability of the organization, we feel that there's new skills relating to some of the impacts and the changes that are made by moving to things like variable cost models that you'll have to be trained up on. And we believe that budgeting process will shift in order to really provide the best value. Next, we talk about IT strategy. And again, this really is a fundamental shift. If we think about how we source, purchase, consume, and use IT, this is making a pretty significant change. I think one of the biggest changes most people recognize immediately is we're removing a large amount of the very physical logistics processes related to IT. And so then you start to be able to ask yourself very interesting questions, which is, once I remove these constraints of long order lead times and these sorts of things, how does that shift my IT strategy? What can I do with IT that I haven't been able to do in the past because of cost constraints or resource constraints? So it really helps you rethink IT strategy. You need to rethink some of the core skills of the people that are responsible for IT strategy, and really that strategy planning process shifts as well. Third, we have benefits realization. And benefits realization is looking past the simple ROI TCO calculation to really what is the outcome you're trying to drive at an organization level. And really, it's really shifting the way that you think about that to measuring how are these downstream cloud adoption IT change effects really impacting my benefits at the high level. So it's really focusing on the organization's goals and missions. And are the benefits you're realizing really helping to drive those right goals? The last one is really business risk management. I differentiate this a bit from where most people's head goes immediately to compliance. And this is a little bit different than just compliance. This is really looking at the broader problem. You know, one of the things that we see when we see disruptive companies or disruptive technologies are they're coming in and they're changing the business in a way that creates risk for a business that isn't able to move at that level of agility. So rethinking the core way you think about business risk management and changing some of those processes becomes central to really adopting cloud in a way that provides that high business value. The next perspective is people. And really what we see here are roles around human resources, staffing, and of course, sort of people managers. And to go through each one of these, to start with resource management, you know, if your time to hire is 3 months or 4 months based on your available pool, and all of a sudden you're looking for these somewhat rare right now cloud-capable resources, a lot of how you think about that has to shift. But similarly, you have people in roles today that are doing roles that are doing things that are going to primarily transform with cloud adoption. So really just thinking through resources, understanding the downstream impact to people, and really planning how you use people as you move forward becomes a critical part of cloud adoption. Incentive management we like to talk about as well. Most people are on some sort of incentive plan. They're incented to perform and deliver certain things for the organization. And one of the things that we occasionally see, I should probably even correct that and say one of the things we see quite a bit is this misalignment between the traditional incentive model for people who are working within IT and this new cloud incentive model or this new cloud model. And so this is really about taking a step back, rethinking those skills, rethinking those processes, and ensuring that the incentives are aligned with the types of things you're really trying to drive. Career management becomes important. The place I always point this out, this is probably the most straightforward way to see it, is that compute today is a logistics process primarily. It's order compute, order servers, rack, stack, network. It's a very physical thing. And when that transforms, that is a completely different process. That career path for someone who might be involved in that process today inherently changes. So thinking a lot about how these career paths change and really how the individual resources manage their career path becomes important. You don't want to find an organization with net new resources and a net new role who feel like there's nowhere to go and nothing to do. So these are the types of things we want to take into account as we go through this cloud adoption journey. Training management, I like to mention this one simply because I think most of us in most organizations, you know, we get our class a year or our seminar a year or once every 18 months sometimes. And when we're talking about organizations where there are frequent changes, when we're talking about technologies where we have frequent changes, we've had 236 major feature changes and releases this year so far as of April. That's a lot of changes. Keeping track of that requires a different thought on training. How do you think about keeping your people up to date and up to speed on the latest and greatest technologies to ensure that you're maximizing and getting the best utilization out of those features? finally talking about organizational change management. I always say this is always an interesting one because I think most companies think about this as I get the email about 4 months before something happens, and I get an email again, and then it happened. And we're talking about a very rapid pace of change. That's one of the things that we're really enabling here is that ability to move with agility. And so if your organizational change management processes require, 6 to 9 months of pre-planning, they're probably not going to keep pace with the speed of cloud. Going through governance here, common roles in the governance perspective, we tend to see CIOs, program managers, project managers, enterprise architects, business analysts, and portfolio managers. And to talk through that a little bit, portfolio management is kind of an interesting facet here in particular, primarily because of the need for this real kind of in-between space between the business capabilities and the technical capabilities, or the business stakeholders and the technical stakeholders. And that's where we see things like portfolio management start to become very critical as a governance capability. And so it's really helping the organization ensure that the IT services and the cloud services are really aligning to the business needs and driving the right sorts of outcomes. So portfolio really gets rethought. There's new skills involved here. And some of the governance processes around portfolio management may need to shift to enable the best advantages of cloud. Program and project management, we always like to tell people you absolutely can do a cloud adoption journey using the traditional waterfall project management approach. So it's doable. It's really not optimal, though. It's one of those ones where if you're not really rethinking and really looking at things like Agile and these types of new ways of managing projects, then yes, you'll be able to adopt cloud, but really maximizing that benefit is going to be a bit more troubling and challenging, I think. Business performance measurement. I think this is sort of the sister to some of the higher level governance pieces that we talked about when we talked about benefits realization. But if your goal in adopting cloud is to provide real-time data to sellers to enable them to see more customers and have better, more meaningful interactions on a daily basis, then that's a measure you want to ensure that you're tracking. Are you meeting your goals, and are you driving the things you want to do as an organization? And then the final one here is license management. And this is interesting. This is one where we see from a governance perspective, this was actually the most recent capability added to the cloud adoption framework. What we continue to see with our customers is a real need to shift how they think about licenses and really shift the processes they use for managing licenses. Really understanding those impacts of what does it mean to run something in the cloud versus on-prem, but also really focusing on some of the advantages from a licensing perspective you get via cloud services becomes a really critical part of license management. From there, we're going to move to the technical perspectives. And I'll start with platform. Platform, we see common roles of CTOs, IT managers, and solution architects. And I'll start this. The one thing I like to point out, there's 3 capabilities here. When we talk about capabilities, a lot of times we prelude it by saying the capability doesn't inherently change with cloud adoption. It's really the how. And what's a little bit unique about the platform perspective is this is a place where capabilities actually do change. So it's a little bit more intensive to think through. And so if we look at the way that we typically think about compute, network, storage, databases, these sorts of core IT services in the traditional on-prem IT, what we see is that these get radically transformed with cloud. When we move from these very logistics-oriented, these very physical processes to something that's really much, much more focused on infrastructure as code and automation and these sorts of things, this is a fairly significant change. And if you are the stakeholder who owns these capabilities for the organization, it's critical that we're spending time with you, making sure that we understand your concerns and we're addressing your concerns. If you think, going back again to something we mentioned in the people perspective when we talked about incentives, if your incentives are built around these sort of very logistics and physical processes and they're changing, This is a place where we want to make sure that these are tied in together and that we're really spending time with those stakeholders, making them comfortable with this transition so that we have a successful cloud adoption journey. The other one that I think gets to be really critical here is systems and solution architecture. We talk sometimes about what happens if you remove the physical architectural components from a traditional architecture stack where you start with conceptual, move to logical. But what happens when logical sort of becomes the physical architecture as well? So there's just some core design principles and decisioning matrices that start to become very critical in the systems and solution architecture space. So from a skills perspective, there are definitely some new skills needed to understand how to best take advantage of cloud services. But also from a processes perspective, some of the core architectural processes need to shift to really ensure that they're taking advantage of these new paradigms. Finally, we talk about application development. We could potentially have a webinar unto itself just on the changes that happen to this organizational capability. I think we talk about things like changing processes, adopting things like DevOps, the new skills you need to understand how to do things like CI/CD and pipelines and these sorts of things. So this is an area where the organization will continue to have this application development capability, but it's also an area where there's a significant amount of reskilling that needs to be done and some process changes that need to be done to really take advantage of cloud. On the security perspective, we look at common roles like CISOs, IT security managers, IT security analysts, and compliance leaders. And really what you should see on the right-hand side are things that should seem familiar to you from an IT security perspective. And again, what we're focusing on are things like identity and access management. It still exists, but how do you take that into account when you're dealing with cloud? So how do you manage identity and access management with cloud services? And so reskilling around that area, understanding some new processes that may be necessary in order to take best advantage of those cloud capabilities becomes a core part of sort of that transformation. Detective control. I think many people who've been in the security business for a long time understand this really, really well, mostly because we own the network and we're able to do all sorts of very interesting things around monitoring when we own the network and it lives in our data center. But we still need this capability. We still need detective control, but how do we do that when we're talking about a cloud environment? So really reskilling around this and understanding how some processes shift in order to facilitate that becomes a critical part of the conversation. Likewise, infrastructure security, very similar. How do I think about a lot of my core infrastructure security components when they're not in my network anymore, when they're not in my data center anymore? Data protection becomes critical. Probably it's an area that a lot of organizations have some concern over at the outset. But I think what most of our customers find is when they really focus on this, really focus on understanding data protection in the cloud world, they see it as something that's very, very doable, very easy. One of the examples I always like to showcase in this area in particular is if we look at Stripe. Stripe as an organization since 2011 has run a PCI-compliant payment infrastructure completely in the AWS cloud. So it's possible to build these secure data protection systems using cloud services. And the final one is incident response. And again, this is really focusing on a very similar theme here, which is incident response when incidents are contained within my data center or within my network. That's a very, very straightforward thing to do. But what happens when you expand that into a cloud environment? How do you think about incident response in that situation? Moving on to operations, we see IT operations managers and IT support managers as kind of core to this. And then when we start looking at the capabilities that transform, I think many of these should be familiar to you, but many of these are looking at how do we extend these capabilities into the cloud. So if we think about service monitoring and how I'm managing my SLAs and my OLAs, it's how do I do that when some of my systems or some of my applications are functioning in the cloud. So it's really rethinking that, changing some of those core processes, really re-engineering the way that we think about service monitoring. And what most customers find is that it's really not a challenge, it's just a little bit of a mental shift to think about this in a different way. Application performance monitoring, very similar if we're used to things like, performance counters and these sorts of things when they're inside our network. How do we do that when systems are running outside of our network? How do we think about these in the cloud environment? Resource inventory management gets interesting. Resource management's really nice when they're big physical things and you can stick labels on them, or potentially bar scan them to keep track of them. But what happens when those resources that you're managing are virtual? And we've seen a bit of this already through the transformation to the virtualization of data centers, but this is really extending that into how do you manage things like serverless computing, or how do you think about those types of resources in the cloud world? Release management, change management. One of the things we see many customers adopt in this release management, change management capability is the use of things like CI/CD pipelines and these sorts of processes to manage their release management and change management. And so thinking and how to take best advantage of some of these cloud-enabled capabilities and some of these cloud-enabled processes can really shift the way that you think about release and change management. Reporting and analytics, very similar. One of the things that most organizations find about cloud providers is that we provide a tremendous amount of data and information, potentially more than you have today. And so the question becomes, how do you incorporate that into reporting and analytics into a way that's meaningful for you, the organization? Business continuity and disaster recovery is a great one. I think most of our customers find at the outset just a dramatic improvement in their business continuity and disaster recovery simply by being in the cloud. But I think really thinking how to take best advantage of business continuity and disaster recovery, how to take advantage of cloud services and capabilities to really provide a lot of resiliency at the organization level against those types of challenges is a critical part and one of the biggest benefits that you can get out of cloud adoption. And finally, is IT Service Catalog. Again, IT Service Catalog historically has been very fixated on what IT assets do I have within my data center. And really what we're doing is we're having to rethink the way we think about IT Service Catalog and thinking about what it means to have cloud services and cloud capabilities added to that IT Service Catalog. From there, I really want to take a few minutes and talk you through the action plan, because I think a lot of what we've talked about to this point is we've gone through and talked about this relationship, this model of stakeholders are in a perspective. That perspective provides a viewpoint on the cloud adoption journey from the eyes of that stakeholder. We talked about capabilities, and so really what we're looking at is how does the capability owned by a stakeholder shift with cloud adoption? And we've said that what really shifts is really the how, not the what. And so we've gone through and talked about how skills and processes are really the core pieces that change the how we execute that capability change. So we've got that put into place. So now we have this framework. Now what do we do with it? And so really the goal here, and one of the big areas that we focused on over the past 6 months is really helping to build out this idea, this action plan, to really help customers understand how to do something with the cloud adoption framework and really help them define real actions that they need to undertake in order to help expedite and remove some of those challenges to cloud adoption. And I'm going to show you an example of one. This is one that is based on some real customer data. However, the names have been changed to protect the customer. But just to give you an idea of how we kind of use this action plan, we do have a workshop that we do and work with customers. The output of that workshop allows us to kind of build out this action plan. It is something you can undertake on your own as an organization, but we do say if you want to get more deep on your action plan, we have partners as well as professional services that can help you do this. But to look through this, you'll get an idea of what we're talking about. So if we look at the business perspective across the top, what we're really saying is when we talked with business stakeholders, they had some concerns. And you can probably reverse out what the concerns were just by looking at the 4 squares there on that top line. And then really what we're working to do is to say, what action can we take to help you feel better, to help alleviate that concern? How do we do this? We also capture the stakeholder. We capture who is the person that has this concern, so we can check back with them and make sure that the action has solved for the concern. And so you'll see some examples in here. Under business as an example, we see learn about reporting services for billings. This is a great example. If someone is concerned about the bill model, how they allocate costs, those sorts of things, this is a great example of how we can sit down and talk through this and focus specifically on that to ensure that that stakeholder is bought in. Learn about variable cost models for IT. We could probably presume here that John A. is probably someone involved in the budgeting process in the IT finance side of the business. Billing inquiries, how do organizations or how do the business units in the organization raise a billing inquiry, these sorts of things. So you get the idea of what we're kind of going through here. And you can see a lot of these come up and are very common in organizations. Some of these may even speak to you as you think about cloud adoption in your organization. The first one under people, I think we see a lot, which is identifying roles, skills, and capabilities for cloud-based IT. How do we think about that? That's huge. The second one there is also one that's very common. Review current support model, identify skills gaps and training plans. Hey, we need to move to a model where we're supporting these new cloud services. How does that change support? So you can imagine if you're the stakeholder who owns help desk or who owns support, you probably have a vested interest in understanding how that change impacts you and impacts your team. So these are some great examples here. You'll see some good ones under platform as well that are very common. Establish patterns and standardizations for the cloud. This is a very common architectural piece. How do we create standards and standardized models? That starts to become very, very important. You see under security, this is a great example. When we talk about AWS and the shared responsibility model, you see the second one there, create and agree a RACI model around security operations. So these are the types of things that we see coming out of these workshops, or as we see as our customers work through the cloud adoption framework and look to leverage it to build out a plan. So let's talk a little bit about the process for building out one of these action plans. And so we start with something that may seem very self-evident, but I think it actually becomes a critical to success foundational item of this sort of action plan development process. And it sounds kind of weird, but identify your challenge and your desired outcome. And I don't mean this at the small level. I mean, what is your organization trying to do, or what is your project trying to accomplish, right? It's rarely just move stuff to the cloud. It's usually move this to the cloud to do X. What's my outcome I'm looking for? Am I trying to improve a business metric? Am I trying to improve agility? Am I trying to improve cost? So start by really identifying the challenge that you're working on and really the desired outcome. Why? Because what you're going to find is that there are stakeholders to that challenge and there are stakeholders to that outcome. And so really, as we start to focus the cloud adoption framework and we start to focus what we're doing, we're focusing around a challenge and a desired outcome. That's the pieces or the people we want involved in this action plan creation. And I'll say, just as an aside on this, people often ask me, they say, when is the best time to leverage CAF, or when is the best time to work on an action plan? And I think this is really that first step is really the answer to the question, which is once you have identified a challenge and you've identified an outcome, that's a good time to sit back, go through the cloud adoption framework, leverage it, and build out an action plan. So you'll find yourself revisiting this as a process multiple times as you continue your cloud adoption journey. Second, the reason for the common roles and that starter set of capabilities that are in the cloud adoption framework is really to help you identify who should be there and really think about the capabilities that are the critical ones that change kind of early in the process. So going through common roles, they're sort of genericized roles. They're not going to tell you it's the vice president of blank. But looking through those roles and thinking through who those people are in your organization, specifically that care about the cloud project you're working on, is a good way to start to identify key stakeholders. But sometimes we find just by role, that doesn't necessarily give you all the stakeholders. So the second thing to do is to really look at the list of capabilities and say, who owns these capabilities for our organization? And so it's using both the roles and the capabilities to really help you drive out and identify that core set of stakeholders. Third, we like to do this with sticky notes when we do these live, and it's actually kind of a good technique to get what we like to call that voice of the customer. So really, what is the specific thing that these stakeholders are raising? So it's really determine the questions, challenges, and concerns from the stakeholders and writing them down. So, sometimes it's just a question, and questions sometimes can just be simple feasibility questions. Well, I don't know if we can do this. I'm not sure about blank. Sometimes they're challenges. Those challenges can be everything from technical to organizational to structural. And concerns can just be, I'm not sure how this impacts this, or I don't know how this has this downstream effect, and I really want to make sure that I understand those well. And so it's really get those questions, get as many of them as you can, write them all down, and really collect that list of key questions, challenges, and concerns. And then what you'll find as you go through these and as you think about them, you'll be able to determine if that concern can be remediated by developing new skills. So in other words, is this sort of a competency, knowledge, skills types of questions? So I need to really approach it as skills. I need to do some training, some knowledge updates, those sorts of things. Or is this something that's best solved through the creation, update, or integration of processes? So, or is it inherently it's going to change how I do something, the step-by-step I take to execute something, and I want to rethink how that would, how we can do this in a way that solves for the challenges that the stakeholders have raised. Finally, it's really document those activities and the stakeholder in the action plan. And what we're trying to do here is this. The way I like to say this is start by just putting everything and every stakeholder and every item you have in the appropriate column of the action plan. Get all of them in there as much as possible. Fill them out fully. It's better to have too many than not enough is the way I always think about this. So just get as many of these written up and recorded. A couple of things you're going to see that are going to start to come out as sort of apparent patterns. One, you're going to see that there are multiple stakeholders that care about the same things. So that's going to be one. Second, you're going to see that some stakeholders feel they are dependent on other stakeholders, so that there's a dependency between the two. And that's actually one of the other things you're going to want to really capture in the action plan is what's that dependency between the different stakeholders. The other thing you're going to find is that your questions, concerns, and challenges are actually pretty common. And as strange as it sounds, as we do this with more and more customers, we find that these core challenges, these core questions, these core concerns really are shared among many customers. And to an extent, that's good because it means that these are things that we understand well and can typically help work customers through in a very simple way. But once you have all of these activities and stakeholders written down in the action plan, what we like to do, and the reason we call it an action plan, is focus on action. So then what we like to do is do a budgeting or a prioritization exercise. So the goal here is to take those actions, figure out which ones you want to tackle in the next 2 to 4 weeks. And then really take a snapshot of the action plan, only including the things you want to do in the next 2 or 4 weeks. Prioritize those and focus on those. And what you're going to find are a couple of things. One, if you're focusing on a knowledge aspect or you're focusing on a skill, there is almost 100% of the time an associated process. So at some point, you might have just started with a lot of skill-type actions in your action plan. What you'll find is those, once they're finished, are going to create process-related actions that you need to take. And so, in other words, the action plan will continually spin off these new actions that you'll have across the perspectives. And so as you do that and as you prioritize, you'll take your 2 to 4 weeks, you'll complete it, you'll then create your next version of that 2 to 4 week goal, and you'll complete it. And all the while, you'll start seeing, if you stay in close contact with these stakeholders, that you'll continue to get new actions. and you'll continue to get new interdependencies. But this will give you a sort of a visual and a shared understanding as to how to go about those and how to ensure that you're meeting the goals and the needs of all of your different stakeholders. So that's the action plan in summary. So this is really about getting you to a point where there are very specific steps you can take and things you can do to move forward. It keeps you focused on ensuring that you're communicating with the stakeholders, that you're keeping in mind any kind of questions that they're raising, and that you're addressing them proactively so as to be able to continue your cloud adoption journey without starts and stops. And so, actually, I should have advanced there. So this is where we talked about prioritize those actions for the next 2 to 4 weeks. We talked through that. So make sure that you've got that priority. And remember, once you complete a 2 to 4 week cycle, the goal is then to create another action plan summary that has those next 2 to 4 weeks of actions on the action plan. And with that said, we've reached the end of this presentation.